Time to begin. So this week we're going to look at the argument for morality, or not for morality. I'm not going to argue for morality. I'm going to argue from morality to God's existence. And I think this is my personal favorite argument for God's existence. As I mentioned last week, I was really inspired by the first time I heard this argument is probably 20 years ago. I read C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity, and he goes through this argument in the first half of that book, and I just loved it. It clicked with me, and ever since then, I've been studying all kinds of different versions of it, and really enjoyed thinking about this argument a lot. So hopefully tonight I'll introduce you to it. We're going to play the video like usual, and then we'll jump into the slides. And the slides are pretty. There's a lot of them tonight. There's a lot to go over, so hopefully we'll have time to finish them all. Sunday morning, it was like 10:40 or 10:45, and I still had about 10 slides left, so I was panicking, and I was like, oh no. But we kind of yammered on for a long time Sunday morning, so I don't even think I got started till like 9:45 or 9:50. So without further ado, I'm going to switch over to the video. It's, as usual, about 5 minutes, and then I'll come back and we will start going through the slides.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because he is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
So we're on week 5. You made it to week 5, which is impressive. So we're more than halfway done. And this week we're going to talk about, can we be good without God? This is the moral argument for God's existence. All right, so here's the argument. The argument is pretty simple, but we're going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting to defend the first premise. So the first premise is, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. So we conclude, therefore, that God exists. So most of the next hour is going to be spent defending the first premise. That's really the hardest premise to defend. The second premise we'll talk about a little bit, but that one's easier to defend. So we're going to spend most of the time defending premise 1. But before we do, we need to talk about what the argument is not. And the reason this is important is because when I've interacted with atheists about this argument, or I've seen atheist videos or commentaries in books about this argument, they all seem to misunderstand it. And so I want to clear up those misunderstandings before we begin. So we are not arguing that if a person does not believe in God, she cannot be a morally good person. That's not what we're saying. In the video, it showed the atheist helping the cat get down from the tree, right? And, atheists can help cats get down from trees, and Christians can help cats get down from trees. So we're not arguing that you must believe in God to be a morally good person. That is not what the argument is. We're also not arguing that a person cannot recognize objective moral values and duties without believing in God. In fact, Paul in the book of Romans explicitly states that everybody has a conscience and awareness of the moral law. So, it'd be crazy to say that, if you don't believe in God, then you're not going to be able to recognize moral values and duties. I mean, we all have friends, family, coworkers who are not believers, and they seem to understand right and wrong, at least in general. So that is not the argument. And finally, we're not saying that you cannot formulate a system of ethics without referring to God. again, this is empirically obvious. We have all sorts of groups of people throughout history that have formulated systems of ethics without referring to God. Now, we as Christians might think that those ethical systems are deficient, but they could still formulate them without referring to God. So we're not arguing any of those three things. So as we get started, we need to carefully define what we mean by values and duties. And we're also going to define what we mean by objective and subjective. Those four words are really important that you grasp, or you won't understand the argument. So moral value refers to the worth of a person or action, whether it is good or bad. So when we say something is good or bad, we're referring to that thing's moral value. Whereas a moral duty refers to our obligation to act in a certain way. We're talking about whether that action is right or wrong. So moral value has to do with good or bad. Moral duty has to do with right or wrong. So let me give you an example. It would be good for you to become a doctor, but you're not morally obligated to become a doctor. After all, it would also be good for you to become a homemaker or a farmer or a diplomat or lots of other jobs, but you can't do them all. Furthermore, sometimes all you have are bad choices. You know, think of the movie Sophie's Choice. If you've never seen Sophie's Choice, the famous scene in the movie that is when people say, "Oh, I'm facing a Sophie's Choice," this is what they're talking about. It's during World War II. It's a woman. She has two children, a little boy and a little girl. They're arrested by the Nazis, thrown on a train, taken to a concentration camp. She gets off the train with her two children, and there's two lines. There's a line to the right and a line to the left, and the Nazi says to the mother, choose one child to save, the other one's going to the gas chamber, or the other one's going to be killed. And she, of course, refuses to choose. And the Nazi says, if you don't choose, then both of your children will die. And so she has to choose one of the children. And she ends up, I think she chooses her son, and her daughter goes off to be killed. But in that case, right, both choices are bad. But it's not wrong for her to choose one since she must choose. So now let's talk about objective and subjective. So something is objective if it is independent of people's opinions. Or put another way, it is true for all people at all times in all places. That's what we mean by objective. So all people, all times, in all places. Whereas subjective means it's dependent on people's opinions. So if something is subjectively true, it is only true for the person giving the opinion. Now, when we refer to objective moral values, we're talking about something that is good or bad, no matter what people think about it. That's what we mean by an objective moral value. When we refer to an objective moral duty, we're referring to actions that are right or wrong, regardless of what people think. So that's the key to this argument, is when we say objective moral values, we're saying something that's good or bad for all people at all times. And if we have an objective moral duty, we're saying that this is an action that is right or wrong for all people at all times, regardless of what people think. So an example of an objective truth would be the laws of nature, right? The laws of nature are true for all people at all times and all places. They are what they are. They're true for all people. whereas a subjective truth has to do with matters of taste, like, for example, whether coffee tastes good or what your favorite color is. So these are person relative and subjective. So think of objective is true for all people at all times. It's a fact that's true for all people, whereas subjective is referring to matters of taste and matters of opinion. And an interesting experiment that my wife and I used to do when we taught youth was we would, well, we didn't actually give them a jar of marbles, but we would use the illustration of we had a jar of marbles, and we would ask them how many marbles are in the jar, and then we would have different flavors of Starburst candy. And we talked about, are your religious beliefs more like counting the number of marbles in the jar, or are they more like which flavor of Starburst you like? So the number of marbles in the jar is an objective fact, right? If, let's say, there's 200 marbles in the jar, that's an objective fact, whereas which flavor of Starburst you like is subjective. And disappointingly, most of the time, a pretty hefty percentage, at least half of the kids would say, oh, your religious beliefs are like Starburst. It's just your personal preference. It's your taste. It's just your opinion. Christianity is not true for all people at all times and all places. It's just true for people that like it. And then, of course, that would launch us into the lesson where we would say, well, no, Christians actually believe that Christianity is objectively true. It is not a matter of opinion. So let's talk, now that we have those definitions out there, let's talk about the first premise. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. So why is that true? So something is good or has value insofar as it fulfills its purpose. This is a handy definition of goodness. Something is good insofar as it fulfills its purpose. And if you think about that definition, I think you'll agree with it. You've maybe never heard it put that way, but I think it makes sense when you think about it. Something is objectively good insofar as it fulfills its objective purpose. So we can say something's good insofar as it fulfills its purpose, but we can only say something is objectively good insofar as it fulfills its objective purpose. So the God of the theistic religions, and certainly of Christianity, has given human beings objective purposes. So purposes that are true for all people at all times in all places. Therefore, it is possible for human beings to have objective goodness or objective moral value. So to kind of draw this out for you, at the highest level, the objective purpose that God has given every human being is to know him. Right? That's God wants every human being, and in fact created every single human being that has ever lived in order for them to know him. That's why he created all human beings. So that is our purpose. That is an objective purpose. It is a purpose that is true for all people that have ever lived. There is no person that has ever lived that God did not intend to know him. Now, because we have free will, some of us choose to reject God, but that's beside the point. That just means we did not fulfill the purpose God gave to us. But God purposed every single one of us to know him. Therefore, a human being's actions are good insofar as they cause her to better know God. So that's how we're able to identify saints and sinners, right? That's how we're able to identify good people and less good people and bad people, is we look at their actions and we can judge, are their actions causing them to better know God or not? I mean, really, that the whole Bible, which is, a library of 66 books, is telling us how to know God. Like, that's the whole point of the Bible. And if if you do things to help you to better know God, then by this standard, right, you're good. So let's move to atheism. On atheism, there are no objective purposes for human beings. Why? Because humans are the result of accidental physical processes governed by accidental laws of nature as described in biology, chemistry, and physics. So there's no objective purpose on atheism for human beings. Each person has to make up their own purpose. So purpose is 100% subjective. It's just what each person desires for themselves. There is no objective purpose on atheism. So here's what Richard Dawkins said, who again is one of the most famous atheists in the world. He said that there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. So, and you can find quotes like this among a lot of atheist writers. They say things like this, and what's ironic to me is when I talk to village atheists or people who are not academics or scholars, and I tell them, your leaders, your atheist leaders say that there is no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. A lot of the people I talk to just can't accept that. And I say, well, that's the logical conclusion of your worldview. That's what your most prominent thinkers believe. But a lot of them seem unaware of this. So here's a quote from Bill Craig from the book. On atheism, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature that have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe, and which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. This is not the person you want to invite to the funeral to give a eulogy. And I noticed that atheists are rarely invited to funerals to give speeches and eulogies. I can't imagine why. All right, so that was moral values. Let's talk about moral duties now. So recall that moral duties are moral obligations, and they can only be imposed on us by a moral lawgiver who has authority over us. I mean, think about it. You cannot be under an obligation to do something unless a person who has authority over you has imposed that duty on you. It doesn't make sense to say that I have a moral obligation unless a person has imposed that obligation on me. If you think about our legal system, right? We have legislatures which pass laws. And when they pass those laws, we are obligated to follow those laws. But we don't follow laws that aren't passed by legislatures or by people who are in authority over us. So likewise, we will be under no obligation to follow a moral duty if there wasn't a person who imposed that on us. So objective moral duties that are true for all people at all times in all places could only be imposed by a person who has authority over every human who has ever lived. So this is a really important point, right? If we want it to be an objective moral duty, meaning it's a moral duty that all people must follow, are obligated to follow, then it must come from a lawgiver or a legislator who has authority over every human who has ever lived. Otherwise, it's not objective. It becomes subjective. Well, if we need a person who has authority over every human, that is exactly who God is. All the theistic religions and Christianity obviously believes that God has authority over every human who has ever lived. Why? Well, because he created us. He gave us purpose. He loves us and cares for us. Ultimately, his son died for us. So you could go on and on as to why God has authority over every human who has ever lived. But that is exactly who the theistic God is. So here is a summary of man's moral obligations. Love God and love your neighbor. When Jesus was asked to summarize the law, this is the answer he gave: love God and love your neighbor. And again, if the purpose for human beings is to know God, this is how you come to know God. You love God and you love your neighbor. And the rest of the Bible is footnotes to this, or at least the Old Testament is. Jesus summarized the entire Old Testament right here in this one sentence. So this is an loving God and loving our neighbor are objective moral duties that we have. Now, obviously, a normal person would say, well, how do you love God and how do you love your neighbor? And that's where we get into a lot more detail, right? Don't murder, don't steal. You should only worship one God. Don't worship idols. Think the 10 Commandments and all of the other moral commands we receive, but they can be summarized right here: love God and love your neighbor. So what about on atheism? So on atheism, there is no person or persons who have authority over all human beings who have ever lived. Sometimes when you say this, people say, oh, but there's national governments. They have authority over us. Well, they have authority over the people of that nation during a specific time period that government exists. So right now, we live in the United States, so we're subject to the legislature, Congress of the United States. We elected them. They're in authority over us during this time period. But the laws that our Congress passes have no impact on a French person or a Russian person or a Chinese person. They have no authority over them. And so if you don't have God who's in authority over every human, you end up with no one who's in charge. Basically, the best you can do is point to a national government. And even if, God forbid, someday there was a one world government, it would only have authority during a specific time period. So you still don't have a person on atheism or persons who have authority over all people who live in all places during all time periods. So here's another quote from the book. On the atheistic view, human beings are just animals, and animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a lion kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it does not murder the zebra. When a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female, it forcibly copulates with her, but it does not rape her, for there is no moral dimension to these actions. In the animal kingdom, these actions are neither prohibited nor obligatory. So here's Leo. You knew he was coming, and I thought this was as good a place as any to add him in. So Leo says, I am not morally accountable for stealing people's socks. So he does this all the time. If we're not careful, he sneaks into our bedrooms or wherever he can find dirty socks, and he grabs them and he runs away and hides in his crate and covers it up, and he hopes that you don't see it, right? So, I mean, he's stealing our socks. But, you know, we've never held a trial for Leo. We've never called the police on him. You know, we've never lectured him and tried to appeal to his moral sensitivity. He's a dog. You know, he just instinctually likes smelly things, I guess, and that's why he steals socks. But it would be ridiculous for us to say that Leo is morally accountable, because animals are not morally accountable. We like to think that, I mean, sometimes it seems, you know, in our house, my son and daughter are always like, oh, Dad, he knows what he's doing. He knows he's being bad. And I'm just like, yeah, whatever. He's a dog. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's just acting on instinct. And again, he seems to get away with it because he's so darn cute. Okay, so if God does not exist, why think that we have any moral obligations to do anything? Who or what imposes these moral duties upon us? Where do they come from? It's hard to see why they would be anything more than a subjective impression resulting from biological and societal conditioning. Certain actions, such as incest and rape, may not be biologically and socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development have become taboo, but that does absolutely nothing to show that rape or incest is really wrong. Such behavior goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. And I might add, such behavior goes on all the time in the human kingdom. So, probably the most common response to this argument that I hear is, well, evolution has given us moral feelings, and because it's given us these moral feelings that we shouldn't rape and we shouldn't murder, you know, that's why we don't do it. And my response to that is, evolution every day produces people who love to rape, who love to murder, who love to hate, who do all kinds of bad things. Maybe we need those people. Maybe evolution produces these people because it thins out the herd. So you can't point to what evolution produces and take a survey and say, well, most people don't, you know, rape and murder, and then jump to the conclusion, therefore, nobody should rape or murder. That is an illicit conclusion. We cannot come up with an ought from an is. You can't look at what exists in the animal kingdom and among humans and then draw a conclusion about what we ought to do. Because we can find examples among humanity and among the animal kingdom of all sorts of behaviors that we think are really wrong. And so, how do you explain those people? Again, maybe we need them. Maybe they're crucial to the survival of our species to have these terrible people. So, the rapist who goes against the herd morality is doing nothing more serious than acting unfashionably, like the man who belches loudly at the dinner table on atheism. If there is no moral lawgiver, then there is no objective moral law that we must obey. So, I mean, hopefully you can see that if our moral feelings come from evolution, which is a purely biological process, then there is no person behind our moral feelings, right? There's just a physical process behind our feelings. And why would we feel any obligation to follow the commands of an impersonal physical process, right? It's just nonsense. If you walked by, if you were out on the beach and you saw in the sand was written, don't murder. If you truly believed that the wind and the waves and the water created that message, don't murder, then you would completely ignore it, right? You would go, oh, look, it's just total chance. This chance natural process, created this sentence, don't murder. That's how we react when natural processes by complete chance happen to tell us how we should behave. We completely ignore it. But if you walk by and you see in the sand, don't murder, and you just saw someone, maybe a priest or a preacher, just wrote it in the sand, then you would go, okay, well, this person is giving me moral guidance here. They're giving me a moral duty. Maybe I should do that, right? So when a person gives you a moral command, you follow it if that person's in authority over you. If there is no person, if we only have natural processes giving us commands, then it becomes completely incoherent to follow those commands, right? We don't do what rocks tell us to do, or squirrels, or birds, or erosion, right? Those things cannot give moral commands. So, therefore, it is reasonable to conclude that if God does not exist, there are no objective moral values and duties. Without God, without there being a person to which all humanity is under authority, there's no chance for objective moral values and duties. We're left with subjective moral values and duties, meaning we're left with people's opinions about right and wrong, depending on where they live, what time period they're from, what culture they're in, how they were raised by their parents, what their genetic makeup was when they were born. We're left with all of that, and that is subjective. That is not objective. All right, so let's talk a minute about the Euthyphro dilemma. This is a very popular dilemma that is thrown at Christians or theists in general. And it comes from one of Plato's dialogues. So it's very old. This is from, 2,300 years ago. So here's the dilemma that is presented to Christians. Something is either good because God wills it, or God wills something because it is good. That is the dilemma. Again, in my interactions with atheists, they've thrown this dilemma at me about 1,000 times. And and every time they throw it at me, the person that I'm interacting with thinks they've really got me. Oh, I've trapped the Christian. Like, there's no way out of this. I mean, it's one or the other, right? Something's either good because God wills it, or God wills something because it is good. So what's the problem here? Well, both of these choices present a problem for theists. We don't like either one of these choices. Because if you say that something is good because God wills it, then what is good becomes arbitrary. So if this is true, then God literally tomorrow could change his mind and decide that hatred is good. And then we would all be morally obligated to hate one another. Or, tomorrow God could decide it's good to murder. You're allowed to murder. If you want to take out innocent human lives, go for it. I'm changing my mind on that. I'm pronouncing murder to be good tomorrow. Well, that just seems crazy. And, as Christians, I don't think we can take this option. It goes against everything that God is and stands for. Well, the other option says, if you say that God wills something because it is good, then what is good or bad is independent of God. So in that case, moral values and duties exist independently of God, which is a problem. So if you have God here, here's God. And if God actually has to go outside of himself and, look at a moral law which exists outside of him to decide what is right and what is wrong, right? That's a problem. Because then God doesn't give us objective values and duties. This moral law, which is kind of this floating thing out in space, is how we get objective moral values and duties. And God basically is just referencing that moral law, right? He's got like a book called the moral law that he didn't come up with it. He doesn't even know where it's from. But anytime he issues some command, he has to look up in his book. Well, let's see, what's the moral law say about murder? Oh, it says it's wrong. Okay, well, that's what I'll tell Moses to write down on the 10 Commandments. If that's really what's going on, then that presents a serious challenge to theists, because God becomes irrelevant to objective moral values and duties. So how do we solve this problem? So here's the solution. We don't need to refute either of the two horns of the dilemma, because the dilemma it presents is a false one, meaning there's a third option. There's not just two options, there's at least three options. So the third alternative is that God wills something because he is good. So God's own nature is the standard of goodness, and his commandments to us are expressions of his nature. So in short, our moral duties are determined by the commands of a just and loving God. So God does not have to look outside of himself to figure out what right and wrong is, what good and bad is. It's in his nature. He is the ultimate standard of goodness. And what he does is he issues commands to us based on his nature. So that's how we escape the Euthyphro dilemma, is we don't have to pick either one of those options. We have a third option. So we looked at the first premise was, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now we need to talk about premise 2, which is that objective moral values and duties do exist. This one will go a little quicker. So we know objective moral values and duties exist because of our common moral experience. So all we have to do is look within ourselves and watch other people, and it seems like we're all pretty much operating on a pretty common set of moral experience. Our common moral experience tells us that some things are objectively good and evil, right and wrong. So actions like rape, torture, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable or unpopular. They're not like a man belching at a dinner party. They're moral abominations. By the same token, love, generosity, and self-sacrifice are really good. I mean, there's no there's nobody that thinks love, generosity, and self-sacrifice are bad. Everybody thinks they're really good. And I'm pretty sure everybody that's ever lived who has their faculties about them believes that those things are really good. So people who fail to see these things are simply handicapped. They're the moral equivalent of someone who is physically blind. And there's no reason to let their impairment call into question what we see clearly. Now, the truth is, everyone I've ever met, um, at least to my knowledge, with the exception maybe of a psychopath, which there are psychopaths who truly do not understand moral reasoning. Basically, the way a psychopath decides how to act is they watch other people and imitate them, but they don't understand, they don't have the same moral feelings that normal people do. But if you are talking to someone who's being obstinate and denies that any objective moral values or duties exist, and that's a very common response to this argument, is a person will say, well, there are no objective values or duties, everything is subjective, it's just people's opinion. Then here's some strategies for how to talk to that person. Number one, remind them that if even one objective moral value or duty exists, then the premise is true, right? We don't need a bunch of them. We just need one. If you can get them to admit that one moral value or duty exists, the argument goes through. So I know this sounds terrible, torturing a baby for fun, but you want to use clear examples when you're talking to people, because you'll find that they'll, and I've actually had this conversation with someone. I said, don't you believe that torturing a baby is wrong for all people, all times, and all places? And this was a clever guy, and he's like, well, no, I don't. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, what if there was some, maniac with, a nuclear arsenal, and he said, he put a baby in front of me, and he said, if you don't torture this baby, I'm going to drop a nuclear bomb on this city and kill 1 million people. Then in that case, you would be morally obligated to torture the baby to save 1 million people. And I'm like, okay, fine. How about torturing a baby for fun? And then he's like, all right, you got me there. Because, there's, this is wrong. I don't think there's any exception to this one, right? If you actually come across a person that says there's a situation where torturing a baby for fun is not morally wrong for all people that have ever lived, you might want to just step back from the conversation, because you're either dealing with a psychopath or you're dealing with someone who's not having an honest conversation with you. They're playing games with you, and they're just, they're not having a real conversation. They're just trying to get you riled up and angry. Here's another trick that I've used many times. Find a moral value or duty that they think applies to all people. So when you're talking to people, everybody has hot buttons about what they think is right and wrong. Everybody does, right? Some people think it's always wrong to be intolerant. Some people think it's always wrong, to pollute, or it's always wrong to be racist, or it's always wrong to, say hateful things about gay people, right? You can always find a moral value or duty that the person you're talking to is a hot button for them, that they're very concerned about, right? You just have to listen to them and listen to what they say. And obviously, if you know them, it's easy. Everybody has certain moral values and duties that they think apply to all people. And finally, ask them about moral atrocities from different times and places. So if you remember several weeks ago, I had a picture of these ladies standing on the statue that they had torn down. They tore down a statue because they said that the person in the statue was a racist. But of course, that person lived 200 years ago. And if morality is not objective, then how in the world can a person today place a moral judgment upon someone that lived 200 years ago under different authority, right? Different government, different culture, different time period. And it's interesting too that skeptics of Christianity love to point to the alleged moral atrocities that occur in the Old Testament, which was 3,000 years ago. And, when I hear them say that, I'm like, well, how can you judge people that lived 3,000 years ago? You're a moral relativist. You don't believe there's an objective moral law that applies to all people at all times and all places. And yet they will sit there and say, well, it's wrong for the Israelites to commit genocide against the Canaanites. And I'll go, oh, okay. So you think genocide is wrong for all people at all times and all places? And if they're being honest, they'll go, well, yes. And then I'll say, we just found an objective moral duty. The argument goes through. So a second response I get a lot is people will say, there are no objective moral values and duties. And the reason I know this is because humans disagree all the time about morality, right? Some people think abortion is wrong. Some people think it's right. The list could go on and on about moral disagreements we have. So here's how I respond to these people. First, I say, just because we disagree doesn't mean that there are not objective right or wrong answers to moral questions. The fact that two people disagree about something in no way means that there's not a truth to be found. After all, scientists disagree about scientific facts all the time. That surely doesn't mean that there are no scientific facts. I mean, if the fact that people disagreed about things meant that there was no objective truth to be found, then why would we bother to try to convince anybody of anything? So disagreement does not prove that there are not objective right or wrong answers to moral questions. If you study history, you'll find that there are a number of moral values and duties that virtually every society recognizes. So we like to think about all the things we disagree about, but at the core, most societies agree on a whole list of things. There's no society that thinks it's good for a soldier in combat to be a coward and run away and leave his friends. Like, there's no society that believes that's right. There's no society that believes killing an innocent human being for any reason is good. So you can find a whole list. Obviously we have the 10 Commandments in the Bible, and the 10 Commandments have significant overlap with other moral law codes of peoples that lived in that time period. Don't steal, don't murder, honor your father and mother, don't covet. I mean, these were not just things that Jews believed. These were things that all the surrounding cultures probably would have agreed upon. So we finally made it to the conclusion. From the two premises, it follows that God exists. And the moral argument complements the cosmological and design arguments by telling us about the moral nature of the creator of the universe. It gives us a personal, necessarily existent being who is not only perfectly good, but whose nature is the standard of goodness and whose commands constitute our moral duties. if we stack up the arguments from the past 4 weeks, we have a God who's a first cause, who's personal, who's a necessary being, who is very powerful, very intelligent. And now this God we've shown is perfectly good, and whose nature is the standard of goodness. So we have a much thicker slice of God now, with the addition of this moral argument, or argument from morality. All right, so chapter 7, that's for next week. So before I open it for questions, next week we're going to look at an argument against theism, which is the problem of evil, or the problem of pain and suffering. So the most popular argument against God existing is the fact that bad things are constantly happening to us. We suffer, we feel pain, people die. That is the most powerful argument against God. So next week, that's what we're going to look at. Okay. So I know that was a lot to digest. So let me have your questions or comments. Rob, could I put you on the spot and ask you to close us in prayer?
I'll do it.
Thank you.
Father, thank you for this opportunity to gather to study a book that's about how we can better understand who you are and why you are, and how we can defend that in our public debates. I thank you very much for Billy and his preparation and his desire to fully understand this and then to share that knowledge with us. Thank you for those that are participating in their effort to keep up with Billy. It does take a lot of work, and that's okay. And we just pray that we're faithful in doing that. Thank you for this day. Be with us throughout the week. We'll give you all the glory and praise in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Hey, everybody.
I'll definitely send this out.
Thank you, Billy.
Please.